This story is crazy. It involves a serial killer, his own searches on Google, and how this ended up being the reason that he got caught. This man was already 67 years old when he was finally arrested. But here's what happened. This guy had been doing these Google searches on things like how long does it take for human remains to decompose, or what is the best place to bury a body. And he was doing all of these searches from his personal computer at home. And if you were to just look at those search terms, they don't really seem like they would be used by somebody who's planning on going out and committing a murder. But for some reason, he was doing these searches, and the police ended up getting access to all of this data, and it led them right to him. So, in this video, we're gonna break down exactly what happened here, the details of this case, and everything else you need to know. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe, and consider supporting me on a platform. The link will be in the description. First, let's talk about this case. This story was all over the news back in 2021, and still is to some extent. The man who was doing these searches was named Joseph James DiAngelo. He lived in California, and in May of 2021, he was finally arrested after the police in California linked him to a series of murders that had taken place between 1974 and 1986. There were 13 murders that he was connected to. These victims were all found in California, mostly in the Sacramento area. And for all of these years, the police never knew who was responsible. But then, in 2021, they made a breakthrough. They identified Joseph James DiAngelo as the person responsible for these crimes. But how did they do this? Well, there were a couple different factors. First of all, there were some witnesses who came forward and said that they saw this man near where one of the bodies was found. The police also found some DNA evidence that matched him. But neither of these pieces of evidence was enough to get him arrested. Here's the thing. For most of these crimes, the statute of limitations had already passed, meaning that even if they could prove that he committed these crimes, he could not be punished because too much time had passed. But there were 3 of these murders that took place within the statute of limitations. So, if the police could connect him to any of those 3, they could charge him with those. And eventually, they would be able to use all of the other evidence as well. In order to do this, they needed more evidence. That's when they started looking into the history of internet searches on these computers. The FBI discovered that somebody had been searching on Google for things like how long does it take for human remains to decompose, or what is the best place to bury a body. They traced this IP address of this search history back to a house in a town called Citrus Heights, California. Then they sent an agent to that address to do surveillance and see who was coming and going. What they saw was a man matching the description of the suspect sitting outside of his house. He was described as being either 67 or 68 years old. Then, when the police finally searched his house, they found a lot of evidence connecting him to these crimes, including some items that belonged to one of the victims. It was at this point that they decided to arrest him. And when they arrested him, they charged him with the 3 murders that occurred within the statute of limitations, which meant that he could be punished for those. But they also had enough evidence at this point to charge him with all of the other ones as well, even though the statute of limitations had passed. After his arrest, many people started wondering, why would a man who is almost 70 years old suddenly start doing searches like this, unless he was planning on going out and committing a murder? And now that I've told you his age, let me know down below in the comments. Do you think that he was 67 or 68 years old when he was arrested? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Now, here's where things get really interesting. A few months after his arrest, his lawyers tried to get the evidence against him thrown out. They argued that the police never should have been able to access his search history in the first place. But the judge said that because there was a legitimate investigative purpose for the search, and the way that they obtained the information, it was legal. Then, in November of 2021, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, this is where things get even crazier. After pleading guilty to these crimes, he actually confessed to committing even more murders. He was suspected of committing 13 murders, but he confessed to committing at least 25. As of recording this video, he has not been charged with any of those additional crimes, but I'm sure that the police are investigating them. And now let's move on to the next part of the video. Was Joseph James DeAngelo psychotic? This is probably the question that many of you are wondering about. The word psychosis refers to a mental state in which a person is disconnected from reality. Psychotic symptoms can include delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior. In order for somebody to be considered psychotic, they must have at least one of the following symptoms. These symptoms are a delusion, a hallucination, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized behavior, or catatonia. A delusion is a false belief that is not based in reality. Hallucinations are sensory experiences that occur in the absence of stimuli. Disorganized speech is talking in a way that is confusing or makes no sense. Disorganized behavior is acting in a way that is unpredictable or inappropriate. Catatonia is a state of immobility or unresponsiveness. If somebody has these symptoms, they may be experiencing psychosis. But it's important to note that not everyone who exhibits these symptoms is psychotic. These symptoms can also be caused by a number of mental disorders. Psychosis is not a diagnosis in itself. Rather, it's a symptom of another disorder, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, or delusional disorder. Now, I'm not qualified to make any diagnoses in this case. All of the information that I've given you comes from publicly available sources. But I think that it would be very difficult to argue that this man was not psychotic. At the very least, he was functioning in a psychotic state when he carried out these crimes. Now, this raises a lot of questions. Why was he not diagnosed with a psychotic disorder earlier? Why wasn't he institutionalized? Why wasn't he receiving treatment? Why didn't somebody help him? And the answer to all of these questions is probably that he hid it very well. For many years, he held a steady job, and he even served in the military. He was very careful to hide his symptoms so that nobody would ever know. But eventually, his symptoms started to show, and he began to act in ways that were strange or bizarre. People in his neighborhood started to notice this. They described him as being odd, creepy, and a little bit scary. One person even said that he looked at her funny, but nobody really thought that much of it. Nobody really paid much attention to these thoughts until it was too late. I hope that this case serves as a warning to all of us that we should never ignore mental health. We should always pay attention to the warning signs and try to get help for ourselves or others when we notice something wrong. Now moving to our final section. What can we learn from this case? Well, This case is a great example of how mental illness can affect a person's behavior. Even though Joseph James D'Angelo was functional for most of his life, he was still struggling with mental illness. This illness eventually caused him to commit terrible crimes. It's important to remember that not everyone who struggles with mental illness is violent. In fact, most people who struggle with mental illness are not violent. But it's also important to remember that mental illness can cause a person to act in ways that they never thought possible. In this case, the police were able to catch a serial killer thanks to his internet history. He was doing Google searches that gave away his plans. And this is a good reminder that the internet can be a dangerous place. We should be careful about what information we share online. The internet can be a great tool for learning and communication, but it can also be used by people with bad intentions. We should always be aware of our surroundings and take precautions to protect ourselves. So that brings us to the end of this video. Please put any opinions, thoughts, or comments down below in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I appreciate you watching. Thanks so much, and see you in the next video.